Good morning. I'm Carly Grant, science teacher, West Hill High School.
Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Miss Taylor, AP Psychology teacher, Ed Psych, US History.
Do you notice when a student is anxious and how?
Usually I can notice that a student is anxious. Some are better at hiding it than others, but usually when a student is anxious, they'll either tuck in or come out, right? So it presents in different ways depending on the kid. So tuck in is, obviously what it sounds like. They're really quiet. But coming out, they talk really fast, or they'll kind of come at me really fast, or usually they ultimately, with a little bit of trust and time, they'll just tell me.
On a daily basis, I think you can pick up on when you know your kids, you can pick up on when something's off, whether that's anxiety or just a general discomfort. But there are definitely times that it'll be reported to me later that the kid was feeling anxious and I've completely missed it. So sometimes there are visual cues and other times not so much.
Yes, it's very clear. A lot of you have physical things that you do, whether it's biting nails, some people twiddle with hair, some people fiddle with something very specifically and you notice it happens during tests, or when I do the entire everyone's got to speak, so when they know it's about to be their turn, but it's pretty obvious,
What are your thoughts on documented students with anxiety getting medical treatment?
Yeah, everyone needs to do what's right for them and their families. So if that's a decision that their parents and their doctors decide is best for them, then yeah, go for it.
Medical treatment,
Mm-hmm.
as far as what? As far as therapy or medication or both? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, good. I think it's important that if you're not feeling yourself, if you know yourself better than anyone else, so if you're not feeling right, then seeking medical treatment is obviously the right course of action. As far as drug therapies go, that's where it's a little bit more gray area, because at such a young age, when your body's still changing so much, you have so many hormonal changes going on, prescriptions can be beneficial, but I know that I've had a ton of students who have had to cycle through different medications because it's not working with their personal body chemistry, or it's just messing with their sleep cycle and they're irritable. So when you find the right cocktail that's good for you, then I think it can be helpful, but I also think that there tends to be an area of time that it's not always great and it actually makes you feel worse.
So I'm a bit old-fashioned with this. Medical treatment is all well and great, but I find that medications provide a crutch, whereas likely there are underlying issues that deal with anxiety that should be addressed. So social worker, psychologist type work, rather than, kind of like the ADD, ADHD thing is over prescriptions are a thing. So let's not just only throw medication at it, but seek to address the underlying issues, because I don't know, I'm not someone that's comfortable with someone taking drugs every day, regardless of what that drug is.
Can you explain the difference or do you know the difference between a student who is just feeling anxious versus one who may have documented anxiety?
Yeah, I think all of us as humans can get anxious over certain things, but if it's, I hate to call documented anxiety because there are plenty of people who should be documented and aren't, but people who are medically anxious, or maybe that's the wrong term, but you get what I'm saying, right? Definitely present in a way that is that can inhibit performance and even just showing up to school. And so people who have actually what's the word? I don't want to call it diagnosed because it could go undiagnosed. But people who are anxious as opposed to having anxiety. Is that better? Okay. She's going, oh. Anyway, Caitlin's going, ah. So I'm going to say it that way. I'm going to say people who are anxious as opposed to having anxiety. I think if you have anxiety, then it can be really impactful on your day-to-day life. And people who are anxious, right, you might be able to like breathe through that and work through it. So, yeah.
Yes. So I myself have certain anxieties. I have something called claustrophobia, which is the fear of being trapped. A lot of people just assume it's sort of like claustrophobia, and it is. And having had those experiences where I do feel like I'm trapped and I feel like I'm having a heart attack is definitely, it's a horrible experience. And so I can better sympathize with people that have diagnosed anxiety disorders because of my own experience with them. But that is, I think, exactly the difference is anybody can feel anxious at any given time over a variety of different issues, whether it's school-based, home-based, whatever it might be. But are you actually having these physical ramifications from that anxiety? There could be that mental, like, oh, I'm really nervous. And I think a lot of times people equate nervousness with anxiety versus full-blown diagnosable anxiety disorders, panic disorders, phobias. It is a different physical experience for those people.
Well, from what I understand, diagnosed anxiety it's like a kind of like ADD, like everyone gets distracted or has certain things that they'll focus on more importantly than others, and then the lack of an attention span. I believe medically diagnosed anxiety is when it is debilitating, where you are paralyzed or unable to complete a task when you feel that anxiety. I'm sure people that just feel anxious could also have moments where they feel it, but I believe it's a frequency issue of maybe it's a little bit too encompassing or too frequent in occurrences. But again, my school of thought is that everything can be solved with a little bit of training and preparation and knowing how to deal with it, because human beings have existed in this world for millennia before all that stuff. And I don't know, I'm just not too happy about the drugs.
Do you believe these students with documented anxiety should get school accommodations, and if yes, which kinds?
I do think that some students do need some accommodations. It's individualized for each student and actually for each class as well. Some classes may bring them more anxiety than others. And honestly, I've given, like my class, I've given accommodations to students without even documentation if I think that they need it and they would benefit from it. Because, right, we're all here just for one thing, which is student success. So, managing anxiety can be a real challenge. And as an educator, it's important to recognize that different students need different things.
Yes. And I think the ones that have been most effective tend to be work extensions, as needed. I don't think, or at least my experience, not every kid needs it on every assignment. You run into the dangers of kids like abusing extended time, but that's a different discussion. But I do think that it can genuinely be helpful, especially if you're talking about a major project. Those can be very overwhelming for kids with anxiety. So chunking it and like extending the time period that you would accept it, I think is helpful. I think a lot of kids experience test anxiety, so sometimes just being able to take a test in a different location is helpful. And again, time and a half on test taking, depending on whatever issues they're dealing with, can be helpful as well.
And what about for undocumented students?
So that I think is completely situational, and that largely depends on a student's ability to be open and honest with you about what it is that they're going through. If you tell me that you're experiencing a rough time and share with me the rough time, I'm always going to be accommodating to that. Because oftentimes people do have periods of anxiety. You might not need to be diagnosed as having anxiety, but let's say there's like a death in the family, or your house burnt down, which we've had in Stanford, right? There are reasons why people will go through periods of anxiety and not have to actually be diagnosed. So that I think comes on the student end, being comfortable enough to share a little bit more about their lives with their teachers. I think when they don't do that, that's when teachers aren't accommodating, when they just think that a kid's making up some BS to get an extension. That's where I think kids get pushback. When you're honest with your teachers, at least for me, and can open up a little bit and offer insight into what you're going through, then there's definitely room for help to be had, exceptions to be made.
I mean, undocumented anxiety, I mean, human beings are naturally anxious. That's why we progressed so far via technology. It was meant to solve the anxiety of just like staying alive. And anxiety tends to pop up when there is something at stake, which personally I believe if you do feel anxious, that means there's a part of you that wants to succeed in it, or you feel like it is important. And so sometimes it's just not being able to know how to confront that thing. So, I mean, undocumented could just be being a natural human being. Like, I feel anxiety. I've had tossing and turning nightmares throughout life about certain things, but you know, you prepare the best so then you feel at ease about them and then you try to move on.
Can you explain the difference and or do you know the difference between a student who is just feeling anxious versus one who may have documented anxiety?
Yeah, I mean, I think like all of us as humans can get anxious over certain things, but if it's, I hate to call documented anxiety because there are plenty of people who should be documented and aren't, but people who are medically anxious, or maybe that's the wrong term, but you get what I'm saying, right? Definitely present in a way that is, that can inhibit performance and even just showing up to school. And so people who have actually like what's the word? I don't want to call it diagnosed because it could go undiagnosed. But people who are anxious as opposed to having anxiety. Is that better? Okay. She's going, oh. Anyway, Caitlin's going, ah. So I'm going to say it that way. I'm going to say people who are anxious as opposed to having anxiety. I think if you have anxiety, then it can be really impactful on your day-to-day life. And people who are anxious, right, you might be able to like breathe through that and work through it. So, yeah.
Yes. Or, I mean, accommodations don't always need to be, say there's presentations and they don't need to speak. It should be a ladder, like all accommodations. They're not meant to exist for you forever. They're meant to be a stepping stone until you're able to cope without those. My big one is speaking in front of a group of people. If you have an accommodation because of anxiety, which makes you not be able to speak in front of a group, that's fine. But I'd like to work to a point where maybe you can speak in front of me, maybe you could speak in front of a smaller group and then a larger group, because again, accommodations are not supposed to be a crutch. It's supposed to be a way to help you get to, completing those tasks without the accommodation.